With the success of John Carpenter's Halloween, we did see a lot of films sort of come out in response to that idea of, well, if we have this holiday and we can turn it into this moment in the genre, why not capitalize on that?
Oh, ha, ha. Ha, 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 ha! That's really funny, you guys!
And we did see the onslaught of My Bloody Valentine, April Fool's Day, Leprechaun, basically cashing in on St. Patrick's Day. And, we saw a ton of Christmas horror come out, especially in the 80s with Silent Night, Deadly Night.
Yeah!
The recurring theme of having a holiday become a horrific experience. It's an obvious grab. Whether it's Carrie or Night of the Creeps, these are prom night movies, but they go horribly different than what you're expecting because it's supposed to be your coming of age and celebration. And like prom night movies are transitioned into adulthood almost.
Senior prom for 1980, Nick McBride and Ken Patton. These two seniors were selected by their fellow students as the most popular.
Valentine's is supposed to be all about, your significant other, and that smashing together, that juxtaposition of what's supposed to be good and, lighthearted and celebratory into, holy crap, this is bloody and evil and people are dying. That idealism and that adolescence that comes to a screeching halt when it slams into something horrific.
There's a universality to these moments in the year, and I think that's a good way to sort of bring the genre into that fold.
Videodrome.
The relationship of body to mind is a potent one in Cronenberg's world, and I think particularly in the 80s, he attacked it with quite a bit of relish.
Cronenberg had a history of really getting at the psychic horror around physical afflictions. Videodrome was a step further, sort of saying we are entering a period of humanity, of human existence, cultural existence, that is going to fuse technology and the body in organic ways.
Television is reality, and reality is less than television.
One of the most potent sequences to me is when James Woods' character sticks his hand in the vagina-like slit in his stomach that has developed. His hand becomes a flesh gun. You have a very Giger-esque image of machinery and flesh and metal becoming one and shooting out cancer bullets, basically, that cause a decay of the flesh of the victim, which you shoot with these bullets. And it's unbelievably imaginative and potent and allegorical and repellent all at the same time, but devilishly entertaining.
It's all about video cassettes. And you look at it now and you just think, gosh, this is so arcane. But it's really genius because it really was predicting in many ways where culture was going and how much more involved the average consumer was going to become pre sort of where things went in the information age. And Oblivion is this kind of cross between a cult leader, a political figure, and a complete low-grade huckster. It's predictive of the darkest side of the Reagan era, of where those types of people would lead us as a culture. Also very prescient. The movie really encapsulates the beginning of the transition of global culture from analog into digital, from how the consumer took in their media and what impact that had on you. No matter how often you see it, it will get under your skin.
Haunting, mysterious, sensual, strange, perverse, riveting. The Hunger.
Well, horror films of the 80s, even the ones made on slightly higher budgets, still had that kind of down and dirty feel about them. They didn't feel like commercial movies, even if they were being made by the studios. And you had a lot of directors like Tony Scott, for example, doing The Hunger and bringing a very different kind of European aesthetic to a big budget studio assignment.
The black box,
The Hunger was such a sensual, sexy movie. It was just melding this scary, creepy vibe with of vampires. And it was all just so kind of sexual and creepy at the same time.
Forever and ever.
A lot of people dismiss The Hunger for being nothing more than style. I disagree because I think the movie is specifically about style and about emptiness.
John?
What's scary about it is the disposability of relationships and how Catherine Deneuve, as soon as her lover becomes too old, she can't even bear to touch him or kiss him, just puts him in a box, stows him in the attic, moves on to the next one. That's extremely horrifying and, a universal horror that, all of us have experienced if you live long enough.
22 years later, Norman Bates is home. Psycho 2.
You don't think of Psycho as a slasher movie, but that was what kicked it all off. That's what inspired Halloween, which inspired everything afterwards.
Psycho was the beginning of my love of movies. It was psychological, it was visual in ways that you'd never seen before. Before Norman Bates, Anthony Perkins, there wasn't a serial murderer. There wasn't a killer that had psychological dimension. That's all Hitchcock and Joe Stefano.
It was inevitable that he would return in the 80s because that was an era of cinematic horror that celebrated the serial killer, the slasher, and he was the original. He was the granddaddy of them all.
Richard Franklin came to me, an Aussie director who'd done Road Games, and said, let's do Psycho 2. And I said, you are crazy. This is prior to sequels being a way of life in the movie business. Nobody wanted to do it because you knew you were going to get ripped apart by the critics.
In Psycho 2, Norman Bates was afforded a great deal of humanity and sympathy. He's been released from prison, he served his time, gone through his therapy, and he's sincerely kind of apologetic for having snapped and killed all of those women and his mother. And he's just trying to make a go of it, trying sincerely to be the best version of himself, but society won't let him be.
Hey, look, not only is he crazy, he's chicken shit, too.
And so they turn him into a monster again. So by the end of that movie, he is sort of returned back to square one.
I'm sorry, Mother.
Everybody's dying around him, but he doesn't kill anybody, but we don't know that to the end. He finally does kill somebody. This little old lady who admits that she's his mother and she's been doing some of the killings, and he serves her poison tea. And as she starts to gag and die in the poison tea, he picks up a shovel and brings it smashing down on the back of her head. And it's the first time that he's killed in the entire movie, and you realize that he's totally insane.
Now there's a new name for terror. Cujo.
I remember having to audition and screen test for a movie off this giant book that intimidated the crap out of me. I was supposed to read before I auditioned, and it was like, this is a movie about a mom and a kid stuck in a car with this dog? It's like, oh yeah, that's actually pretty scary. For 2/3 of the movie, it's two people in a car, right? If you get out, you're dead. And if you stay in, like, no one's going to find you and you're dead. And it's sort of like the original escape room. Anytime you put a young kid in a scary story, it really brings it home, because you never want harm to come to a child. And I think that resonates on a biological level with every human being.
I was more terrified of Cujo than I was of werewolves. The terror felt real. The panic felt real. You could feel the heat, the stifling stagnancy of being inside that car with them, and the desperation of, well, how do you get out of this? And as an adult, it's interesting because now I watch it and I feel kind of bad now for Cujo. Whereas a kid, I was like, screw that dog. And like now I'm like, oh, but he got bit. And I feel bad for him now. So it's interesting. But as a kid, Cujo was terrifying. And I think that's what makes Stephen King's stuff so great, is that he knew how to prey on your fears, and it wasn't always the same fears.
Sleepaway Camp. You won't be coming home.
Sleepaway Camp is such a great little film because you're not expecting a lot from it. You're thinking, oh, it's another campground killer film. It's mostly like younger kids that are getting killed, and that's such a big no-no today. It's really scary, it's really done well, it's got some amazing effects for such a small little film, and it's just really entertaining.
Sleepaway Camp breaks all the rules. It's an upside-down slasher, and I think that's part of its appeal. All the males are sex objects. Look at those camp counselors in those booty shorts that cut off all the circulation in their, genitalia. The females in the movie are all monsters.
Well, say something, you spoiled little bitch!
And of course it has that final shot that's one of the most memorable moments in all of horror history.
I remember watching it with a bunch of friends for the first time. We knew nothing about it before the internet was spoiling everything. And back then we had no idea. Hey, this is Sleepaway Camp, a horror movie in the woods, and we're watching it and enjoying it. And then the end came. Me and all my friends were just, what?
How can it be?
Christine.
Christine came along after the thing, and it was a Stephen King novel, haunted car movie. It just seemed right to do.
Do we live on? Do we have a spirit? Can it live on in a 1958 Plymouth Fury? That was taken on by Carpenter, and he made it his own.
It's so lean, it's mean, it really gets to the nitty-gritty of what you would want out of a movie about a killer car. And I think Keith Gordon actually gives one of the best performances that we've ever seen in a horror movie of the 80s.
Why don't you just be straight with me, okay? You've had it, right? Well, fuck you, bitch!
There's a scene in Christine where the bullies had just destroyed the car, and the kid is standing in front of the car and he says, "Show me." And the music kicks in. It's like,
show me.
Christine put itself back together again. We had to figure out how that worked and was convincing, so we pull the car in and shoot it in reverse. You've got hooks on the car and you just crush it. And then in reverse it opens, it becomes. And it worked out pretty well for us.
It's an amazing effect for something so simple, but it's done so well. And matching that up with his score, it just works perfectly. I'm getting like goosebumps thinking about it. It's so good.
I never wanted to work in 3D. I'm not, just a gimmick deal. It always has been.
I was always intrigued about what 3D could be, and I'm still waiting for it.
The first 3D horror movie I saw was actually one of the 1950s classics, The Creature from the Black Lagoon. The Gillman had a huge impact on me as a kid. 3D lasted only a very short time in the 1950s. There was this revival of 3D that began with the movie Coming at Ya. That kind of kicked off this whole wave of new 3D movies that were done in the 1980s. Producers saw this as one more way to make a little more money. You had a number of franchises that happened to be up to their third sequel, so it just seemed to make sense that, hey, we'll do version 3D.
I like where things come at you. Popcorn comes at you, a harpoon comes at you, and it was spectacular.
Really notable, first off, because this was the first time that Jason Voorhees actually put on the hockey mask. Every few minutes, something pokes you in the eye. There are so many 3D moments in this movie. They find reasons for characters to have yo-yos and baseball bats and all kinds of fun stuff that they can stick into the camera. And then there are some really great 3D deaths.
It messed with the storytelling because you had to wait for the 3D gag so people would go, "Oh, look, there's the machete."
There's a character who gets speared on a pitchfork. Probably the greatest moment in the film is when Jason squeezes a character's head so hard that the guy's eye pops out right into the camera. The first horror 3D movie in the 80s wave was Parasite. It marked one of the first screen appearances by very young Demi Moore. I have a pair of Parasite glasses here. It was shown in polarized 3D, directed by Charlie Band, released by Embassy Pictures. This is a promotional kit that they put out for the movie, a pop-up promo that shows you the Parasite. Also released in 1982 was a picture called Rottweiler, also known as Dogs of Hell, or Rottweiler, the Dogs of Hell. Genetically modified dogs that have been trained to be military weapons that end up in this small North Carolina town where they go on a killing spree. These are Rottweiler glasses. 3D can enhance a good movie, but if you're already starting with a dog, the 3D isn't gonna really do much for it. Amityville 3D came out in 1983, directed by Richard Fleischer, an early screen role for Meg Ryan. There's a pit in the basement that apparently leads to hell. There are some really good 3D moments in the movie, and the pipe comes right through the windshield and ends up sticking right into your face. There's a swarm of flies that's sort of composited in and meant to look like it's coming off the screen. The moment that everyone remembers, this demon pops up through the hole in the basement floor and grabs one of the characters.
Save yourself!
The big three of the 80s 3D horror films were the ones that were all the third sequels. So the studios found interesting ways to promote these 3D movies, and Jaws 3D was no exception. Another pop-up where the shark comes right at you. The third dimension is terror.
Which I think this would have been a better movie if it wasn't called Jaws, and they just called it like Sharks in 3D, or Shark Attack coming at you.
Young Leah Thompson made one of her first screen appearances as one of the water skiers who gets attacked by the shark. The plot takes place at this aquarium, sort of SeaWorld kind of place. Probably the best 3D moment in the movie. The shark has already eaten Simon McCorkindale, and he was holding a hand grenade. The arm with the hand grenade is still in the shark's mouth, so they reach in and pull the pin, and the grenade goes off, blows up the shark, and all these shark bits come flying right at the camera, including the shark's jaws.
Having a giant, bloody underwater explosion in 3D, that may be why I give that 3D movie a pass.
I don't think that the 3D really helped any of these movies improve their box office. For the most part, the studios were using it just as a gimmick. I should note that in 1991, the sixth movie in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, Freddy's Dead, the big climax of the movie was a 3D sequence. It's kind of a shame that they waited until the sixth movie to do it rather than having a Nightmare on Elm Street 3D back when they could have.
Stephen King's Children of the Corn, an adult nightmare.
Children of the Corn is taken from the Night Shift Stephen King short story and stars a pre-30-something Peter Horton and pre-Terminator Linda Hamilton as they find themselves in the wrong Nebraska town at the wrong time with the wrong kids.
If you're a kid who grew up in the 80s and somebody says to you Malachi or Malachi, you knew exactly what they meant. The idea that kids would band together to kill an entire community of adults at the behest of this other entity, that's horrific. I never saw people my age as a threat. And that was a movie where I realized, oh, people my age can do horrible things.
It was he who walks behind the rose.
The whole movie, they're talking about he who walks behind the rose, and when you finally see him, it's just a big mound of earth that's moving around, and it's actually kind of impressive for 80s effects. How'd they do that? The effects in the climax are kind of cheesy, but if you're a King completist, there's enough in here to make it worthwhile.
It goes back to Lord of the Flies, kind of the same type of story. Kids unsupervised are evil, so it's automatically scary.
Friday the 13th, the final chapter.
In the fourth installment of Friday the 13th, we get Joseph Zito directing a new cast of fresh meat ready for slaughter by Jason, who's now in his full hockey mask mode after picking up his new look in the last installment. It's a great cast that features Kimberly Beck, Peter Barton, and Corey Feldman as Tommy Jarvis, who's a recurring character that we'll see 2 more times. It's also got a pre-Back to the Future Crispin Glover, who's got the best dance moves I've ever seen this side of Footloose.
Crispin's dance is just one of the greatest moments ever. He gives it his all, and I appreciate that. Amazing, like one of the greatest scenes in all of cinema history.
I don't know if anyone could do that dance, but it's something like... It's something like that. I don't know, man. Ask him.
Hey, how come you turned that off?
I love that little Corey was obsessed with like Monster Mask, and he has a little computer. Like, ooh, he's like a monster nerd like me. That's pretty cool.
Ted White takes on the Jason Voorhees chopping chores, and I know everyone loves Kane Hodder, and so do I, but Ted White might be my favorite Jason.
Little monster man found courage and just took Jason out in a big way. I mean, who knew shaving your head would have that effect? Corey did.
The effects work of that machete going into the side of Jason's head, and then he falls on it and his head like slides down the machete, that has got to be some of my favorite special effects in any horror movie. I love that machete face slide, man.
So there was a kid in the candy store kind of thing happening in the early 80s with Stephen King adaptations. Everybody's got to do a Stephen King adaptation. We're going to do The Shining. We're going to do Christine. We're going to do Cujo. And Firestarter was part of that wave.
Will she have the power to survive?
John Carpenter decides he wants to make Firestarter because it's got an anti-authoritarian streak in it. It's a road movie, and he's a Westerns guy, so he loves that. It's got a father-daughter dynamic, an emotional core, and he's super excited about that. But The Thing was received poorly. The Thing bombed, and John Carpenter got Firestarter taken away from him as a result.
Universal fired me from Firestarter because by the time The Thing came out, a horror movie market at that time had shrunk to teenage boys who couldn't get in. They were too young. That was the market for horror films. You couldn't do a big budget horror movie. You had to do a little tiny one. And I couldn't do Firestarter that way.
Dino De Laurentiis comes in, puts in, I think Mark Lester is the director. Firestarter has its moments, and all of the behind-the-scenes stuff can't take away from those exchanges between Drew Barrymore and David Keith. George C. Scott is in there doing his whole crazy ponytail, blind eye thing, and it's a lot of fun to watch. Art Carney and Louise Fletcher as the kindly couple. It's really well cast. It's a nice looking film. The pyro effects are pretty good too. It's just, I will always lament what could have been.
Gremlins.
Gremlins made a huge impression on me. It took place at Christmas, and the father gets the gremlin for his son as a gift. That influenced me with Child's Play. The obvious takeaway for me personally was the animatronics and just how sophisticated they were. Those puppets, Gizmo, Stripe, etc., they all had distinct personalities. It became obvious to me with that film, there's nothing that a writer could write that a good animatronics team and team of puppeteers couldn't actually put on camera.
Gremlins is a kind of an anarchic movie. It had started out as a low-budget horror film because Spielberg wanted to create his first movie for Amblin, and he wanted to do it in a genre that he knew would be successful. But as the picture went on and he got studio backing for it, it became apparent that it was going to have a smaller audience, the more gruesome it was. Because we shot material we didn't use. There are shots missing in the kitchen where Mom stabs the gremlin with a knife. There was a shot of the gremlin writhing with a knife in him. We took that out. When Glenn Turman, the science teacher, gets killed by the gremlin, in the movie, you just see his rear end with one needle in it. But in what we shot was his entire face covered with needles like Hellraiser. Once you look at what you've got, you say, well, okay, what kind of movie is this becoming, you know? And it was obvious that this was a much more whimsical movie than a slasher horror movie. And so we toned all that stuff down. And even then got lots of criticism for like, you're making a horror film for children, it's horrible. But kids liked it. And it's remained remarkably popular. The problem with Gremlins was that we were inventing the technology as we went. And so many things that were called for in the script were impossible to do. Gizmo, the little fuzzy character, who had originally was supposed to turn into Stripe the bad gremlin. And then at the last moment, Steven Spielberg got the brilliant idea, which I'm convinced is one of the reasons the picture is still popular, that Gizmo should be in the whole picture and he should be the hero's pal. And we had no way of making him work. He was made to run for one reel, and then all of a sudden it was like, now he's the star of the movie. So we had to do a lot of quick R&D to try to figure out how to make him a character. The one scene that was really complicated was the scene in the bar with Phoebe Cates. And we had to have her there, and so we waited and shot it at the end of the picture after everybody had gone home. And we just spent 1 week in this bar with these puppets soaked with beer and popcorn, making up gags, basically. Well, what would happen if there was a Flasher gremlin? What would happen if there was a Frank Sinatra gremlin? And it took forever. I mean, it was really a long time. And the smell, I just can't tell you how awful it smelled.
A new masterpiece in fantasy terror.
Of the three great slasher villains of the 80s, Michael, Jason, and Freddy, people argue who was better. There's no question that the best character was Freddy Krueger. Wes Craven created a well-rounded villain that comes out of the nightmares of children. He's a child molester who can also kill. There's nothing scarier than that.
Wes was a visionary. You know, Nightmare on Elm Street was so brilliant. It came at the right time when the slasher film was really starting to get a little tired. All of a sudden, it wasn't a guy running around with a knife killing people. That really changed the direction of horror films.
The reason I think that it had such a powerful effect on people is because there's not one person that doesn't have a dream or doesn't have a nightmare. So it was a reality there.
Wes Craven was a very well-read and intellectual person. I would say every scene has a much greater significance philosophically and a worldview that talks about the loss of innocence, how you approach fear, the subconscious and the power it has over everything that we do. I don't know of any other character that has the wits and the intelligence that Freddy has. When I read the script, it didn't occur to me that he was that evil. Like, oh my God, this is hideous. I think Tina's death scene might be the one scene that makes Nightmare on Elm Street not only really scary, but really great. It was so sad and heartbreaking that when I saw it, I realized, like, wow, we're in a totally different league. And there were shots that were shot that Wes didn't include that just went over the top. And I think Wes realized that you can't go between a young girl's legs more than once in a movie, because he does that in my bathtub scene as well, which was completely like crazy at the time to think of that shot. The camera, just where it's located, was extremely provocative and menacing, but also it was definitely raising the bar for kind of the sexuality and brazenness of that young girl situation. So Nancy Thompson as a character is incredibly virtuous, but she's by no means perfect. But I think the virtue she embodies the most is her ability to face fear, which everyone is struggling to do that every day of their lives, right?
Whatever you do, don't fall asleep.
Robert Englund. Everything he did was studied and measured, and he did it for a reason. He used the glove really carefully, and it was always choreographed exactly when he would open up his fingers, when he would clank them together. He was just so generous as an actor. He never wanted to be in the spotlight, ironically. It backfired, obviously, on him because everyone's watching Freddie.
The night the teenagers ruled the world. Yeah! Night of the Comet.
You want to think, if everybody was gone, that you would figure out a way to survive. Tom Eberhardt, when he was writing this, he took some of his daughter's friends out and he said, okay, it's the end of the world, what would you do? And this is a lot of stuff that they told him that they would do. He swears to God that this is not a social commentary.
I am really glad to see it.
Of course it's a social commentary. It was a low-budget movie. I thought the script was very funny. I had no idea we were going to end up encapsulating the 80s.
Here's Samantha.
It put me in bright colors because I was the last thing alive that was pretending like everything was okay. So, it was red and fuchsia and turquoise. And they had Catherine Mary Stewart, who played my sister, in drab outfits because she knew what had happened. All those fashions, that's just what we wore. They built that cheerleading outfit for me so that it fit like a glove, first of all, because cheerleading outfits, the one I wore in Fast Times at Ridgemont High did not fit me that way. Cheerleader with an Uzi, I don't know that I can explain that. When I did it, it made perfect sense to me. And that scene where I start to cry, we're going to cut that scene. That's her arc. That is the point when she admits that she knows. Because at one point they were just going to kill her. She's just going to be annoying and she was going to die. They went, no, because she's like one of the most relatable characters. There's a magic on a movie where everything could be right, but it just lays there flat. And then you can have unknowns and $5 to make something with, and just the chemistry or whatever weird thing that is, boom. And that's why I think we all love it.
One of the most scary things about horror movies is having this villain who you can't reason with, and you're sure that you're going to die. They're going to kill you.
Oh, there were so many villains in the in the 80s canon that you were really into. I gravitated to a little bit of the silly, so I thought the Critters were really cool. Gremlins were cool. I always loved monsters. Tall Man kind of came into his own in the 80s, didn't he? Phantasm always had that kind of cult status, but when Phantasm 2 came around, that was rock and roll.
It's only a dream.
It's a dream.
No, it's not.
80s horror was a good time for villains because it started to get a little heightened, started to get a little cartoonish, maybe a little campy, a little colorful. Greg Stilson in The Dead Zone. He's very much on my mind these days. I love the 1-2 punch of Dr. Hill from Reanimator and Dr. Pretorius from Beyond. Real old school, almost Karloff-like in the way that they come across.
Norman Bates is a guy who lives next door. Leatherface, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, they were all exaggerations and they were mythologized slashers. In the case of Freddy Krueger, he was burned in a fire and is scarred. And Jason Voorhees, also horribly scarred, but hidden behind a hockey mask. And Leatherface is literally wearing the faces of victims that he killed. But in Norman Bates, he's the boy next door, but capable of the most horrendous murders to protect himself and his family. He was a little mad, and we all go a little mad sometimes was his motto, and it should be his t-shirt.
Mentally unstable people with childhood traumas who then manifest those traumas into real life horror shows. For me, Norman Bates was kind of a real reflection of things that could happen, and that is scary.
My favorite 80s villain is Edward Harriman from Lost Boys. It was M. Night Shyamalan before M. Night Shyamalan. It was that twist where you're like, no! Out of nowhere, he is the main vampire. What the fuck? You watch that movie now, with that knowledge, and it changes everything. Everybody else is just so overt in their evil, whereas he's the cunning guy.
If the killer wasn't over the top, then the kills were.
The Friday the 13th films are the backbone of horror in the 80s. The fact that there were so many of them in the 80s, that's pretty impressive. Audiences wanted that character back so many times. Throughout the series of the films, the makeup is completely different, but you know what? The fans don't give a shit. They just want to see Jason again, and that's why there has been 12 Friday the 13th films, basically, and they got to do one more.
Michael Myers has spanned over several films now. It's evil personified. Yes, you could go off all day about how the sequels are and whether you like part 5 or 6 or whatever, or the Rob Zombie films or anything, but still that character just remains. It's an iconic image that just is part of the horror Hall of Fame.
The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, there's me and Freddy and whatever, you know, that come out, and that people just loved to revisit the characters and stuff like that. This is what made them happy.
We'll tear your soul apart.
Pinhead's like an incredible character in those movies because he's genuinely terrifying. I mean, here is a guy that has like 100 nails stuck in his head, comes from hell, dressed in like BDSM leather outfit, and just wants to play with you until you've been ripped to pieces.
He's not hiding around a corner waiting to jump out on you with a stiletto blade. There's a whole process that goes on here. You have to be interested in the idea of exploring pain and pleasure. You have to have the right motivation behind the thumbs to make Pinhead ultimately interested in you. Even then, he wants to stop and discuss the weather and the price of fish with you. It's the dark, dirty corners of your mind and your heart and your soul that he's really interested in. Then we might get down to the hooks and the chains.
The 80s spawned a lot of franchises. I mean, Chucky was kind of a badass bad dude and super funny and fun to hate.
And you have a date with death.
Chucky hides in plain sight. He just sits in the scene with all of the other characters, and they have no idea that there's a ticking bomb in the room with them.
It's dead.
Who was the better antagonist, Jason, Michael Myers, or Freddy? In my opinion, there's no question. The most complex and the most well-written of the three is definitely Freddy Krueger.
How do you not love Freddy Krueger, too? I mean, come on. He started out as something different in the first movie, then they moved away from that.
He killed children, and yet we held him up on this pedestal, and there was dolls and like all of these things that were for kids, marketed for kids, a talking Freddy doll. This is a child killer, people.
Come on, John. Good job.
Obviously, he runs the gamut from being really scary to being really corny across all the different films.
You flung.
But Robert Englund really brought a sense of style and charisma and just this attitude to this character.
I respect how hard it is to create an iconic figure, and marketing it to kids is the best way to do that. And certainly with Freddy, that is a giant piece of his success, is the marketing, the records, the gloves, the shirts, the hats, the costumes, you can buy a onesie that has Freddy on it. You can buy so much with Freddy on it, and that really was the key to his success. And then everybody else were like, oh, there's the formula for that. And the hockey masks, the chainsaws, it all becomes this big marketing extravaganza. And it works to make iconic characters. It really does work.
when the wolves come out. The Company of Wolves. Rated R.
Company of Wolves is magical. It takes Little Red Riding Hood and turns it into something really provocative and Freudian. It has to do with red dresses and menstrual bleeding and werewolves. In this one, the wolf head emerges out of the human mouth, and that transformation takes place in a totally different manner than you've seen before. It's still makeup effects, and it's still puppetry and change-o-head type technology, but in a totally different way. It's a really special movie that not enough people have seen.
Company of Wolves was I thought, a really interesting movie. I was a little miffed when Neil Jordan said he didn't want to make a piece of shit like The Howling. So it kind of prejudiced me a little bit. But it's a good movie.
Coming soon for you, The Stuff.
The Stuff, which is a blob movie, basically, is about killer yogurt. that eats you. It manages to be hilarious and scary at the same time.
Look out! Don't get none of it on you! Keep back!
It's a comment on consumer society, except you're not consuming the stuff out of the can. The stuff out of the can is consuming you. I mean, it's terrific.
If you want to make a movie about American industry producing products that poison the public, that would be a wonderful movie, but nobody would go to see it. Now you take the same idea and you make it ice cream that they're putting out in the marketplace that consumes you from within. And now it's an entertainment movie. Sell your message at the same time as you entertain. The whole idea of our picture was that people go out and buy this product and eat it and become addicted to it and love it. So it was about everything else that's addictive. Michael Moriarty was remarkable in the first picture we did together, which was Q, and nobody could have been better. So naturally, I would want to work with him again. We did the same thing as Fred Astaire in that famous dance routine where he danced on the ceiling. They turned the room, we turned the room 360 degrees upside down. The only difference is that in this one, it was on fire. I beat the stuff with a stick. When it didn't want to do what I told it to do, I didn't care. When no one was looking, I give it a couple of whacks, and that got its attention, and it pretty well did what it was told after that, With actors, it's one thing, because they have feelings and and they have agents and they have lawyers. But with the stuff, it was totally mine. I could beat the shit out of it.
The dead shall have their day. Day of the Dead.
My father was one of the first horror hosts in the country in Pittsburgh. His name was Chilly Billy, and he had a show called Chiller Theater and Night of the Living Dead. My father was in it. George was a master, and he was always ahead of his time. As everybody says, a giant of a man, a tall teddy bear. He was approachable. He loved actors. He gave us freedoms. Sarah was holding it tight, trying to hold it together. She had to hold it together. She was a scientist trying to figure this out, had to deal with all these jerk guys in the military.
Oh, yeah, we forget to write them up sometimes,
You've got to write them up. It's essential. Can't you get that through your thick skull?
She had warmth and compassion, but mostly you don't get to see that. You see her harder exterior. At the time, people were trying to compare Day of the Dead to Dawn of the Dead, and it was a completely different movie. They were very disappointed, and it was too talky, they would say, or not enough gore, although at the end, Tom Savini, his crew, did a beautiful job. The practical special effects on Day of the Dead are remarkable. Greg Nicotero was a young guy on the show, and he was like 19 years old, but obviously very talented.
We used to talk to Washington all the time. They could hear us then.
Dawn of the Dead changed my life forever, just in terms of never knowing where George was going to take us.
Let's just walk through it once. Action!
I was basically Tom's assistant, so I ran the department for him and ordered all the supplies, hired the crew, all that kind of stuff. He always wanted to use real intestines as often as we could. You can't get better than the real thing. So we would use pig intestines. The big showstopper in Day of the Dead is when Rhodes is torn apart. The culmination of everything that we did in that movie led to that moment.
And then they just have a feast on his guts and on his body and his fingers and mostly the guts inside.
When we shot that scene, we used rancid, rotted intestines. And I remember a couple of the zombies actually took earplugs and stuffed them up their noses because the smell was so bad. When George yells, "Cut," everybody's doing this to wave the smell of the rotting intestines away from Joe Pilato's face. We didn't know any better to just go out and buy new guts. We didn't want to spend the $80, I guess. I don't know.
I think that the gore in Day of the Dead is actually very appropriate. It's over the top at the end, of course it is. That's George's humor. That's what was so remarkable about George's films. They get better and better with age.
Fright Night. If you love being scared, this could be the night of your life.
Hot off the success of his Psycho 2 screenplay, Tom Holland wrote and directed Fright Night and took everyone by surprise.
It left the great movie monsters behind, and I wrote Fright Night in reaction to that, and also because I had grown up loving the Hammer AIP vampire films. I love Christopher Lee.
It stars William Ragsdale, Amanda Beers, Stephen Jeffries, and Roddy McDowall opposite Chris Sarandon.
What you do is have a gonzo horror fan look out the window and see his next door neighbor, a vampire, chomping down on somebody. And then, of course, if he's a horror movie fan and running around saying, "Vampire, vampire next door," nobody's going to believe him.
He's a vampire.
A what?
You can't make the villain all bad. You have to have the ambivalence where there are saving graces to the villain to make him a three-dimensional character. He's been given eternal life, but he always loses the one he loves.
She's someone I knew a long time ago.
Roddy McDowall kills it as Peter Vincent, who's a B-movie horror host named after Peter Cushing and Vincent Price, and he's forced to take on the real deal.
It was a cool movie that actually had a sense of history as well. It had everything you wanted. There was great gore. There were hints of nostalgia with McDowall and that kind of hint towards the Hammer movies, you know.
I had the best effects crew extant in Hollywood at that moment, and Fright Night is full of in-camera effects.
There's that final scene where Charlie and Peter Vincent confront Jerry Dandridge in the basement and Amy gets in the way.
And she says, "Charlie, you told me that you'd save me."
You promised you wouldn't let him get me.
And then she comes back to him. And when she came back to him, I realized there was a huge scare that was there. And I went to Steve Johnson and I said, "Steve, give her a shark's mouth that'll scare the hell out of every kid." That it ends up being the definitive image on the one sheet and has become cosplay. Yes. Who knew?
The Return of the Living Dead.
Return of the Living Dead, I think, is such a great horror comedy because it never stops being horrifying, but it's so gut-bustingly funny.
I remember a very significant moment of watching Return of the Living Dead when they brain the thing and it doesn't work. Because then everything you think you know is out the window. And it's one of the first maybe meta zombie movies that's playing with those expectations, where they take a moment to explain all the rules that they learned from watching Night of the Living Dead.
I thought you said if we destroyed the brain, it'd die. It worked in the movie! Well, it ain't working now, Frank. You mean the movie lied?
And then when those rules don't apply to the situation you're in, suddenly it becomes, anything could happen.
They weren't the mindless flesh eaters. They were fast, they were smart, they were not what you were expecting. They're killing the paramedics, they're killing the cops, and one of them gets on the CB radio and is like, "Send more cops!
Send more cops!"
And it's just hilarious because you've never seen that in a zombie movie before.
The Tarman scene, I remember looking at it and thinking, I had no idea how they did it. Because something so specific is happening with the anatomy of that thing. It's just one of those accidentally iconic moments of horror with the design and with the actor and with the way he was carrying himself. It's an indelible image of 80s horror.
That woman corpse that they cut in half. It was made by a friend of mine, Tony Gardner, who has done Chucky for the last few movies. They tie her down and have this conversation with her. They say, "Why do you want brains?" And she says,
"It makes the pain go away."
That to me is one of the most horrifying concepts I've ever heard in a horror movie, and so hilarious at the same time. I find that movie fascinating.
Howling 2. It's not over yet.
What can I say about Howling 2? I can say that Christopher Lee apologized to me for being in it. I can say that whatever Philippe Mora was thinking, I don't think it probably got on film. It does have, however, Sybil Danning's dropping her dress 72 times during the end credits, which, that counts for something. The problem with Howling 2 is that it just doesn't make any sense, particularly in that it completely blows the ending of Howling 1, in which the newscaster turns into a werewolf in front of the entire TV audience, and then in Howling 2, nobody saw it. It's like, it must have been the lowest rated newscast in history. And it was shot in Transylvania or someplace like that. Freddie Main is in it. I mean, there are things about it that are interesting, but it just doesn't make any sense at all.
Silver Bullet, the last glimmering hope.
When Stephen King focuses in on small town stories, that's what I loved as a fan.
Well, Silver Bullet was done by Dan Attias, who was one of my assistant directors. It's a werewolf picture. Another one of those movies, 80s movies with a kid hero. Yeah, it's a pretty affecting movie because a lot of these movies, much like I Was a Teenage Werewolf was, are parables about adolescence. And Silver Bullet it fits into that category, I think, much more so than like something like The Howling or American Werewolf.
The Coreys were kind of everything in the 80s. Silver Bullet was my first time seeing Corey Haim in anything. And I just fell in love with that kid. And I thought there was something very special about him in that movie. And of course, Gary Busey, his Uncle Red, with all of his little Uncle Red-isms, Ta-da! And it made me scared of the dark again. Because there's something out there. Everett McGill as Reverend Lowe, it's such a great performance.
You meddling little shit!
And it's interesting to me that in that movie, he didn't even have to be the guy in the werewolf costume. But he did it because he was so method.
Reanimator. It will scare you to pieces.
I had no idea that Reanimator would become a cult classic.
We needed to find a way to separate our film from so many of the others because everyone was making horror films then. Basically, Lovecraft doing his version of Frankenstein. It's about someone who has a dream that's a very positive thing that turns awful.
You killed him!
No, I did not. I gave him life.
It's sort of like be careful what you wish for. The idea of bringing the dead back to life is something we all wish that we could do.
I like movies where the heads talk and the brain that wouldn't die. And I just think, there's something about that that's real horror to me. Herbert West, he's so full of himself.
You'll never get credit for my discovery. Who's going to believe a talking head? Get a job in a sideshow.
And yet we can't help but like him because he's so enthusiastic and he always makes a choice you didn't guess at.
I think the unsung power of Stewart is his storytelling ability. Stewart's gloriously outrageous. He just goes for it. It's big. and it's brave.
So we had to invent a female character for Reanimator, and we invented the Dean's daughter, Megan Halsey, that Barbara Crampton plays in the film. And this, of course, the scene that got all the attention is the scene in which we sometimes call it the head gives head scene. We knew that no one was going to do a scene like this.
It was a funny thing that they were doing, this, this visual pun. And I thought, I can't turn this down because of this moment on screen that I'm going to have to do. If I knew then what I know now, I don't know if I would have been able to go through with what I went through on Reanimator. I mean, it was quite exploitive. It was really groundbreaking in a way.
That scene is still shocking and taboo.
The fortunate thing is it stopped before it really gets bad. It just goes right up to the edge there. There wouldn't be Reanimator without that damsel in distress like that. It just, we wouldn't be talking about it.
Stuart Gordon's maybe a signature achievement in horror is the ironic tone, the over-the-top pleasure of the horror, the fun of it. He brought a kind of an experience to Reanimator that showed that a cheap horror movie can be really good.
I honestly thought no one will ever see this bloody thing. What did I know?